Yes, then we will start, and I would like to introduce our speaker for today. It's Julie Perkins. She's officer in charge of the Secretariat at UN Habitat's Global Water Operators Partnerships Alliance, GWOPA. She's an urban water and sustainability professional with 15 years of experience working to make basic services more inclusive, resilient, and sustainable. Before joining the UN Habitat, United Nations Human Settlements Program as a program officer in 2004, Julie was involved in urbanization research in watershed management, working with local government and research institutions, and she has a master in urban planning from McGill University in Canada. Welcome very much, Julie. I'm very happy that you're with us today, and we're looking forward to hear more from you about building utilities resilience. And I think I hand over to you with this. You have the floor and you may share your presentation.
Thanks so much, Julia. I really appreciate that. And I think David is going to share the presentation on my behalf, just because I'm a little bit not so technically savvy somehow, especially compared to many of the speakers at this event. Thanks, that's great. So thank you so much for this. It's really a pleasure to be here. When Julia and I decided what we would talk about in this session a few weeks ago, and we thought, you know, we would look at the SMART concept from a slightly less sort of techie angle than the rest of the sessions, looking at capacity for resilience in a wider sense. I think we can, you know, all agree easily that, you know, water and sanitation services are absolute pillars for resilient communities. I mean, it's hard for any of us to imagine what a, you know, healthy, happy, and productive life might look like without being able to count on those basic services. You know, this is in the, you know, the best of times, but especially when the going gets rough. And as you know, as it is, there are a lot of things being thrown at us now when it comes to COVID and climate change and others. So resilience is a very important concept. And since most of the world is getting its these services from local public water operators, helping these operators be smart and resilient is really of great importance here. So, but I would say that, you know, for most of the global south, you know, digital capacity is definitely a component, but it's certainly not the most important component aspect of the smarts they need. So this is why we want to look at it in a slightly wider, with a slightly wider angle and see what role those things have within that. So what kinds of capacity would do a typical water and sanitation operator in developing countries need, and how, and this is where you come in, other utilities, including you know, those in the north and the west and south who are in a position to do so, might be able to help their peers develop the capacity, and they know how they need to be more resilient. If we could just change up the slide then to look at the next one, just make sure we're on the same page. Yeah, thank you. So worldwide, there are tens of thousands of public water utilities out there that are being relied upon for these essential services. Many of them are managing fine, and in fact some are really exemplary in the global south as well. I mean, there's really some excellent examples of productive utilities, but many, and I would say the majority, are struggling with some fairly essential basic things. A typical scenario in cities, the mid-sized and small cities of the global south, is that they're covering only a fraction of their service area. So this is because cities are growing extremely rapidly and just outpacing the ability for the utility to extend services in the way that they should. I lived in Nairobi for many years, and the rate of connection to the utility has dropped dramatically, despite the fact that they're doing relatively well, just by sheer scope of the population growth. The majority of the population then is getting its water from where? Obviously somewhere. We all need water to live. And this is, this tends to be from private wells that are proliferating, often at great environmental cost. And then smaller private operators and resellers of the public water, but often at exorbitant prices and with questionable quality. And the vulnerable and poor populations are the ones who suffer the most from these kinds of things, a lack of access to the directly to the municipal service provider. For those who are connected, they're not that much better off in some places. I'm exaggerating, but the water supply is intermittent, low pressure, unreliable, a couple hours a day or days a week. And the quality is also often questionable. Of course, people are then less interested in paying their bills. Often they don't know how to pay their bills, and so there's this financial vicious cycle of decline as well that happens where people aren't paying. There's less money coming in. The maintenance is not happening, and so extension is the way. Now, this is a bleak, very bleak picture that I've painted. It's even worse for sanitation and wastewater services in many places. But I don't want to leave it there, because there's also a great deal of potential. But I just want to say that with the concept of resilience, which is where we are beyond doing all right, but we're able to kind of roll with the punches of the new things that come up and challenge us. We're really far from that kind of vision in so many of the utilities in the global south, that they're just not able to do some of the most fundamental things, which is serving the whole population with safe water and beyond, let alone deal with the challenges that are arising. Okay, and this is complex and kind of murky situation. Before we turn to a brighter note, of course, there's no magic bullet, and I think there's been some really great presentations here today about fantastic technologies that are available to utilities, and really there's a role for them in the improvement of a lot of the operations of utilities in the south. But this is part of a more comprehensive long-term improvement process. And this is just the essential point that I think we want to take. And this is where I want to introduce the idea of WOPs. So David, if you could go to the next slide. Thank you. So water operators, oh, I think we've skipped a little bit. Can you go back? Kindly. Okay, yes. Funny, there's one missing. Well, you'll just have to listen to me then, because what I want to tell you is what water operators partnerships, or what we're calling WOPs, are. They're an approach, a high potential approach to building the capacity that utilities need. And I said there's no silver bullet. This is not a silver bullet either. It's a very broad type scope of approach, but we think it still has very high potential to make a difference. And these are partnerships between peer utilities that are carried out on a not-for-profit basis, and they're meant to build capacity to make sustainable improvements over the long term. So basically what happens is that there's a utility that is struggling somewhere, and they get hooked up with a utility maybe in Germany that has capacity to spare, and they begin to help one another, mentor one another. And over the course of years, in some cases even decades, they work together to develop the skills, the know-how, and actually put in place the kinds of solutions, the practices and solutions and systems that are really needed to make meaningful improvements. So this is now the slide that I'm at, so keep it there. So just a few points that I wanted to highlight about WOPs. There are lots that could be said about them, but things that I think are relevant here today is that the focus here is really on strengthening local capacity. So we're looking at those individuals and institutions that are expected to really be there in the long run, to be providing these services. There's also a recognition in this that good, safe, local jobs for professionals and frontline workers, which water and sanitation providers are, alike, are key to community resilience as well. This is not just a detail. Workers are also important for sort of strong communities. And not only are peers willing to help their other utilities, but they're actually extremely good at it. There's actually an added value when you're learning from someone with whom you share kind of same professional background. There's a common language there, despite the fact that one might be speaking French and the other Swahili. There's a kind of flow that happens, and a certain respect that really facilitates learning between these kinds of partners. WOPs are also real partnerships. There are a lot of things we call partnerships, which are actually more like contracts. This is a different kind of deal. We're really looking at a situation in which utilities are working together concretely to better understand and co-create the solutions and to problems. We often say that WOPs are doing with and not for, which is, I think, a significant kind of difference from the way a lot of things are done. It's not a consulting thing in the sense that we're not doing it for you, we're doing it with you. So that you can do it beyond the period of the partnership. Now, the fact that they're not for profit is not just incidental or ideological. It is something that is really kind of an essential baseline for there being for enabling good learning. No one's selling anything, so there's trust in all of this. There's really a sense that there's a common objective of making improvements, and so there's a different set of motivations that are at work, and it does change the game a little bit in terms of it flips the dynamic, let's say, somewhat. From some other situations. And all of these things, I think, are innovative and interesting and important in themselves in the way that when we think about moving into trying to scale up effective peer support to address the number of utilities that are requiring assistance. Another point that I think is worthwhile making here, some of you may be thinking, well, okay, fantastic, it's all good and well to train a utility or to build capacity to do something, but the issue is not knowing how to do it. It's having sort of governance frameworks that enable utilities to plan long term, have the financial sustainability and so forth to be able to really maintain their improvements. And all of this is quite relevant and true. However, WOPs can be a very useful, and there are many cases where it's been a useful accompaniment to those kinds of improvements, especially where there's finance involved, where it's supporting really good learning around the use of those things so that things can be maintained long terms. And just by demonstrating the way things work, because there's exchange two ways, not just, also sometimes at the political level around these things between mayors involved, there's exposure to doing things differently. So there can be some inspiration there, increases transparency. And so it also makes some sort of inroads into those wider upstream factors that are important for making the big changes. And of course, they have a huge potential simply by virtue of the fact that there are just so many water and sanitation operators out there that I think are quite keen on reaching out to one another and sharing their professional expertise with their peers in a way that makes some meaningful changes on the lives of others. Okay, we can go to the next one. I just before closing, I wanted to just give you a quick little overview of a few examples of WOPs that have really helped more directly to build resilience, or different ways, let's say, that these partnerships are helping to build, make utilities more you know, not only more resilient, but more sustainable, financially, environmentally, you know, safer, greener, more inclusive. So just, you know, just a few little examples that I have put up there. You know, the first one is about in Ecuador and Honduras, they've been helping one another build capacity around using financing modalities for protecting upstream watersheds, which has benefits for the utility, but also wider benefits for the environment. In a number of WOPs, so many of our WOPs are around non-revenue water and energy efficiency. And in Kenya and in the Netherlands has been helping Nakuru, for example, support, make big improvements to their energy efficiency and their water losses. There have been WOPs based on sanitation, fecal sludge management, and getting operators to be able to take in the fecal sludge, which often just ends up going into the environment, and building the capacity of the sanitation service providers to integrate with the system in a more citywide, inclusive manner. And then in Lusaka, we have one example of about 30% of the WOPs that we work with that focus on increasing services to low-income communities. And in this particular case, it's you know, where the utility in Lusaka is helping others develop low-income service units, which are really made specifically to address the needs of low-income communities in informal settlements, with a series of sort of social and business model innovations, as well as technical ones. So I'll just leave it there. Sorry, that was a little longer than my allotted time for the intro presentation, but I hope that gives a bit of an overview that we can talk about. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. That was very interesting to hear what role partnerships between utilities can play in becoming smart. I thought this was a very well point. At the Blue Planet Berlin Water Dialogues, and maybe I can start with a question directly, Julie. We're talking a lot about innovations. And what do you think are the most important innovations for utilities in the developing countries? And also maybe you could quickly say something about, in your opinion, what role do high-tech solutions play in all of this? You must unmute.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah, good questions. I mean, so I mean, innovation is very important. So I think there are a few different ways to look at it. I mean, I've listened to some very fascinating presentations today about things that some of which would work extraordinarily easily and well in some of these utilities that I'm thinking about. Whereas others, it would just be kind of like window dressing. It would be, you know, it would be this beautiful thing that is not addressing the kind of fundamental challenges. So I think the question, the innovation is absolutely needed. I think we can look at it in a few different ways. I mean, one thing to say is that within these WOPs, there are a lot of digital technologies that are being applied as a support to the capacity development and systems improvements to support performance improvements. So I mean, these are fairly basic things relative to some of the great stuff that I heard about today. But I mean, simple things like GIS systems that really help utilities get a grip on their networks. You know, these ERP systems. There are a lot of these asset management systems are extremely relevant for water and sanitation utilities, even at this scale. I mean, it's just part of the work that they're doing anyway. So they fit in there very, very easily. So, I mean, there are a whole range of kind of essential sort of software tools and management tools that are typical of the, the utilities that operate in Europe that fit in. They have their place. Those are functions that those utilities are doing or need to be doing anyway, and those tools can be of support to them. So I guess that it's just a question of going through the filter of, is this something that is supporting a solution, a more sustainable, long-term, broader solution to the problem. But I do think that there are also other types of innovations that are more about, the social innovations and business model innovations. And another important and huge area is, the whole area about innovation around, circular economy and, the many, utilities in the South. I mean, if they're to actually serve their whole population, it's like doubling or tripling their network. So I mean, there's a lot of potential in leapfrogging, going to different systems that are much that don't take wade us through the errors of our past of flush toilets and things like that, decentralized models with circular systems where there's water recycling and resource recycling and reuse and energy production and these kinds of things. So that whole area of thinking as well. I mean, there's so much potential for that still in the developing South, simply because of the extent of of development that still needs to occur in many of these locations.
So there's a lot to accomplish, certainly on the way to resilience for the utilities. What do you think are the major challenges? Is it financing, or do we have to look at things like water resources, very basic things for a water utility? What do you feel?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that the governance challenges are significant. Many utilities, they simply don't have the kind of, let's say, autonomy is usually the way it's looked at, the autonomy to be able to control their finances and plan long-term around them. So this is, there's really sort of governance frameworks for financing, I think are really critical. But when it comes to this is for sustaining their own finances. When it comes to accessing finance for investment, capacity is often a major barrier to that. So, this is often a reason. There's a lot of money out there that's looking to be invested, but there's an obstacle in getting that to the utilities, because they're not operating at a basic level of service. They can't be guaranteeing a return on investment in any way. So finance is definitely a significant challenge, but the water resources issue is also a significant one. I would say that pollution prevention is a really important factor there. I mean, the fact that wastewater is almost not treated in most African cities is a huge issue. I mean, there's such potential to make a difference there, and that obviously has huge bearing on the quantity of water that is then available for things. So water resources, I think, is also largely an issue of water resource protection and pollution prevention. So these things are interlinked.
Yeah, and when we look at utilities globally, I think they're very different in their environment where they operate, with the capacity they have, with the financing they have. But I believe, and you already told this, water operators partnerships can be a very valuable tool to transfer knowledge and to help utilities to become smarter. A German water partnership, we are supporting this idea also a lot, and we try to encourage more utilities to take part in it. And therefore, maybe the last question, because then we have to head back to the main stage punctually at 5, as I was told before.
Yeah.
But I'm often asked from water utilities that are smarter within Europe, what is the reason why should we take part? Why should we participate in such partnerships? What is your answer to that?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I mean, I think the first reason is that it's super satisfying for people. It's fun, it's interesting, it's very satisfying to be able to help your peers using your own professional competence. I think it's a great experience for those who've been involved in it, and it's very easy to get testimonies from those who've been involved in that. And that benefit at the personal level is really reflected also at an organizational level, because utilities can use this as a sort of also as a human resources strategy. Some places this is an important thing, and that it attracts and retains good staff who are interested in having a slightly more interesting career that takes them to other places where they know that they can be helping others. So I think that's these motivations are really on different levels, but there are really a lot of them, and it takes only speaking to people who have done them in the past to sort of hear their excitement about them. And so it's quite contagious.
Thank you so much. Time flies. It is 5 o'clock. We have to head back to the main stage, but I'd like to thank you very much for this very interesting introduction and impulse. And I'm sure there is a lot to discuss maybe afterwards in the networking area as well. Thank you, Julie Perkins, and thank you for all the participants who joined us here.
My pleasure. Thank you so much, Julia.
Thank you. See you on the main stage in the networking area later. Bye.
Bye.